Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tracy Glab, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Sheppy Dog Lecture. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Dr. Taylor Hagood will be lecturing remotely. Dr. Hagood sends his regrets that he couldn't be here in person, but we're very glad that he can be here remotely. The Sheppy Dog Fund was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to present speakers addressing the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. Before I introduce Dr. Hagood, as always, we'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, whose continued support enables the FIA to provide so many memorable exhibitions and educational programs. And a big thank you to the citizens of Genesee County for the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County citizens. I know everyone will enjoy hearing tonight's presentation by Dr. Taylor Hagood, and we look forward to joining you for the next Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture on November 10th, with a presentation by Dr. Griffith Mann on art in Tuscany before and after the Black Death. Please visit flintarts.org/lectures for more information, as well as recorded presentations of previous Sheppy Dog Fund lectures. A quick word about this virtual program before I introduce our speaker. Since the situation is that we are doing this both in person and virtually, we cannot take questions tonight. Please email any questions you have to Dr. Hagood to his email address, thagood@fau.edu. And I'll repeat that email in both the chat and at the end of this program. For those in the live audience, please remember to silence your cell phones. For those online, you are already muted, but can make comments in the chat box. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker. Dr. Taylor Hagood is currently Professor of American Literature at Florida Atlantic University. He lectures on literature, art, history, travel, music, and the history of magic. You may remember him from an earlier program this year on Houdini. His publications include the C. Hugh Holman Award-winning Faulkner Writer of Disability and Secrecy, Magic, and the One-Act Plays of Harlem Renaissance Women Writers. I now turn the Baroque over to Dr. Taylor Hagood. Thank you, Dr. Hagood, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I do appreciate it. And I want to say thank you to everybody at the Flint Institute of the Arts. It breaks my heart that I cannot be with you today. I really had no idea that that wasn't going to be able to happen. So I'm very sorry about that. But unfortunately, unforeseen things do happen, but I'm so glad that we have the virtual option, and I'm very excited to get to join you at least on the screen. I want to say again, thank you to Tracy and to Catherine and to Lori and to Dr. Klein and to everybody there. And I have to say, I was so much looking forward to being in Flint. I've never been there before. And so I've been looking forward to this time for quite a long time. So hopefully maybe another opportunity will come for that. Very excited to talk about the Baroque tonight. And this topic is one that has interested me for a very, very long time. Long before I guess, decided on certain specializations in my academic career, this was something of tremendous interest to me. Personally and in various other ways. And in fact, my academic career has engaged with the Baroque in various ways, including ways that might seem like neo-Baroque. In fact, the author that I have written on the most William Faulkner, is often referred to as being very Baroque in his writing. And this was something that I encountered very early on when I was studying his work and studying scholarship on it. And I thought, now, how is it that Faulkner could be Baroque? And it really led me, I had already had so much interest, particularly in the painting of Rembrandt and Caravaggio and some of the others we're talking about, but those two particularly, and really at that point in my life, probably Rembrandt the most. It really sent me into a deeper investigation into what the Baroque is. I'm going to say Baroque. Some people pronounce it the Baroque, but I'm going to say the Baroque. And by the way, I will be I'll be um, using some words that are Italian and a few Spanish names. And I would say I know just enough of both of those languages to mix up the accents on them. So hopefully we'll see what happens with that. But anyway, I'm very excited to consider, excuse me, the Baroque in its moment, the time that we think about it, and really the really fascinating thing for me is what it is, and what I really want to focus on. There are many things we could focus on, and I suspect there have been plenty of lectures, and will be others with the Shepherd Dog Fund. And by the way, I'm so honored to be able to work with the Flint Institute of the Arts again in this capacity with the Shepherd Dog Fund. I'm just absolutely thrilled and delighted. I loved the first time and so excited about this time. But, the particular take that I have on it is to approach it with some background in the practice of art and painting, with a professional background in literature and history, and sort of lengthy background at this point, I guess, in lecturing on art. And the particular take that I really want to consider is this concept of Baroque and what are some of its driving forces. And in keeping with the ideas behind this particular lecture series, I want to think about especially religious factors, driving forces, and so forth in the Baroque. And especially, I'm intrigued with this is a lot, but especially I'm intrigued with this, what to me is an interesting question, which is what is it that someone in the Baroque moment saw when they saw this art, when they encountered this architecture, or the music? We could do an entire lecture on the music, or sculpture, or whatever. Interestingly, the writers of this period often are not referred to necessarily as Baroque, especially in English. William Shakespeare's life takes place in the Baroque, technically speaking, and yet I don't know that anyone really talks about Shakespeare as being Baroque. You might talk of him as being Renaissance or early modern. And of course, these movements their borders are not always easy to define. But what is it that people are thinking? And that's a big question, but I would love to get at some of the contours of what it means to be Baroque, what it means to experience what people experienced in the way of art in the Baroque moment. Okay, now with all that in mind, I want to go ahead and share my screen with you. And I will retreat to some corner of your screen. I'm still here. And as you can see, I'm in a very Baroque setting. So I used to live in Munich, Germany. I was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Munich. And there are some wonderful Baroque buildings there. One of them is the Kirche. And it's a beautiful building, very white. This is not it, but a lot of the buildings there, a lot of the cathedrals are very Baroque in style. And I have this image here, and I hope that it will go ahead and present the kind of the weight and detail and overwhelming impulse, you might say, of the Baroque. And I'm going to part the curtains here for this lecture and get it started. And I want to thank you for your applause. That means a very great deal to me. So thank you very much. That came through loud and clear for me. I have this Baroque era, which I am identifying as being from the late 1500s to the mid 1700s. Truthfully, it's mostly happening in the 1600s, in the early 1700s, but it bleeds into the Rococo style, which is has certain similarities, but the spirit of it tends to go in a little bit different direction. And before this time was the Mannerist style, which is a kind of a late early modern, or I guess Renaissance kind of style that tended to more exaggerations, not quite naturalist. So you think about, for example, late Michelangelo paintings, very, exaggerated bodies, very, muscled up to the point of not being, almost not being believable, at least not until now, until we, until we had the right kind of drugs, I guess, to create it. But bodies that would be Michelangelo-esque in his late career, but certainly different from his earlier figures. Anyway, but the Baroque, it's an interesting time period with this very complex, out of bounds. I love this image, very out of bounds kind of a style, swirling, um, in motion, seemingly in motion. This is so much of this, of course, this heavy contrast and this intense, in this case, Caravaggio painting, very intense uh, proximity to the subjects that we're dealing with, and a conveying of the psychological intensity of those, and of course this spiraling up to heaven that is going on, and yet so thoroughly grounded on earth. These are some of the dimensions and some of the images and experiences that one has with the Baroque if one is living in that time. It's very hard to get at what something looks like in someone's time. Although this type of art has continued. Again, I mentioned William Faulkner. People talk about him as being Baroque. And I do want to consider what that means. But also,
excuse me, Dr. Hagood.
Yes.
So we're having a connectivity issue right now. So if you could
Okay.
pause just for one, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No,
right
not
now.
at all.
But are you on this a strong Wi-Fi connection?
Yeah, it should be
Yes.
fine. I've never had
Okay.
trouble with it.
Okay, so let me just, I'm going to see if they're hearing this, and I'll be, they've just asked me to pause, so I don't know what's next. Hold on one second. I'm going to make a phone
Okay.
call. Dr. Hagood, I'm just going to have you keep going because everybody on virtually is hearing this just fine. So I think there's something in the theater that's happening. So I'm going to go check on it. So why don't you just keep going? I don't want people to hold out or wait. We are recording this. So if there's a section that's missed, I guarantee we will have that available. So I apologize to anyone in the theater right now. We're working on it. We're doing everything we can to fix this issue. But I hate to have radio silence. So why don't you just keep going, and then we'll, if anything else needs to be addressed, I'll break in.
I'm more than glad to do that. In fact, I was thinking about taking a pause to open up a thing of Ricola. I had a professor one time who would always pause in the middle of a lecture and open up some candy, pop it into his mouth and carry on. But anyway, where we were, so welcome back. So where we are, the funniest thing about technology, but I'm glad we have it, but it does provide some problems sometime. Anyway, I hope that things are coming across better in the theater now. But basically, where we left off, or where we are at here at the beginning, is I wanted to give some of these initial images. What I want us to think about are, what are these forces? What is driving the Baroque? And there are some answers that have been presented by historians of art, but I would like for us to ponder them a bit more and consider what they may be as a lived kind of experience. And so that's kind of what I want us to think about. So with that in mind, I want to I want to present, okay, here we are, back on track, kind of the background of what we have. Of course, we have the Renaissance period, often referred to as the Renaissance or the early modern period of art. And of course, there had been the medieval period, and so much of the art of the medieval period in Western culture was religious in nature, as far as what we think of as public art, and was iconographic in many ways. And this idea of responding to an icon, or something that is iconographic, that was a very strong kind of a thing. And of course, with the Renaissance period, there's a new humanism and a focus on the human body. And this took the art in some ways that might look more representational or realistic, but they were still quite idealized. But of course, one in that period would have encountered in cathedrals something different from the medieval time. In fact, you can think of, I don't know, the Sistine Chapel, and you look up, and there are several people who are not altogether clothed. So how does this sort of mesh with whatever religious elements are at work there? Well, in fact, there were people who were beginning by the time you get to the 1500s, there were a number of people, as we know, who were very suspicious of what the Church of Rome was doing. One of these, of course, very famously, Martin Luther. And, we're almost in the month of October. So, and by the way, I'm excited about the next lecture in this series, which is going to hit on some very Halloweeny topics, and we have a few here as well. But anyway, Martin Luther, of course, famously nailing his 95 Theses, although in English it was, at least in translation, the title of this document was Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. It's a little bit easier to remember 95 Theses. And whether or not he nailed it onto a door or not, he definitely sent it to the Archbishop of Mainz. And it was on Halloween, 1517. Now, this is important. One little thing about Luther, he was very much thinking doctrinally, and he was trying to work out. Hopefully, you can hear me okay here. But he was trying to work out a number of things doctrinally. But where the rubber met the road, as they say, as far as his conflicts with the Church of Rome, was when he began to attack the idea of selling indulgences. And this, of course, put people, including the Archbishop of Mainz, in a pretty bad spot monetarily or financially. Well, Martin Luther, interestingly enough, was not, in the end, as radical as he was not actually that radical. Ultimately, in the end, in terms of decoration or the functioning of art in religion, there were people who were far more so, though. And these people are the iconoclasts. And iconoclast means idol smasher. And these people were people such as Zwingli and Karlstadt here, and Jean Calvin. Karlstadt had worked with Luther in certain ways. But all of these are some of the iconoclasts, people who said in these religious buildings, cathedrals, and so forth, they said, people, when you have these images of saints or images of religious figures, but particularly saints, there was this idea, they worried that people were worshiping the images. And so it was idolatry, and they saw this as being sinful. And in fact, many folks went on a rampage. There was great deal of violence that takes place during the Baroque era with religion at its center. Certainly not, peculiar to this period, but we have here some images of iconoclasts who are taking these images out of these cathedrals. This one here might be a little more dramatic. You can see these fellows going up, scaling the walls. I have to tell you, recently I've been helping my sister and brother-in-law renovate their house, and I've been doing a lot of demolition. And so this scene looks very familiar to me, climbing up on a ladder and hammering at a wall. So anyway, but you can see that these idols have come down, this idea of iconoclast, an idol smasher. And so these people believed that the art was something that distracted from God. And of course, a lot of the Protestant movements, they tended to move toward a different concept of relationship to God, a different way of thinking about confession, different ideas about what you might say merited works are. In other words, that you have to do certain works in order to have salvation. That would be, in their minds, a more Catholic kind of an idea, whereas they would say, no, there are no works involved at all, maybe, or maybe not as many. So this is the movement, and it's an attack on art, and presumably a certain amount of art was lost. Well, this all was dealt with by the Church of Rome. We'll say the Catholic Church in a council. It was convoked by Paul III, the Pope, and it was a series of meetings in the Trente that started in 1545 and went to 1563, and they essentially established what's called, of course, the Counter-Reformation. So the Reformation is the work of Luther and others to reform the church, and then there comes this countering of this Reformation. What's interesting is it was at the end of these meetings that religious art was addressed, and it's interesting how it was done. I want you to see this. I don't know how many people are familiar with the language, and of course this is in translation, but it's very interesting. This is from the 25th session of the Council of Trent, and this is the article on addressing religious icons and art and so forth. And these are some excerpts. This is not the entirety of it, but again, in translation, it says, moreover, that the images of Christ, of the Virgin Mother of God, and of the other saints are to be had and retained, particularly in temples. So those images are supposed to stay there, and that due honor and veneration are to be given them. Not, now this is key, not that any divinity or virtue is to be believed in them, on account of which they are to be worshipped, or that anything is to be asked of them, or that trust is to be reposed in images, as was of old done by the Gentiles who placed their hope in idols. Now, it goes on for a little bit more, but you get the idea. So it's an interesting move rhetorically. The idea is keep the art. Just let's make it clear that you're not to worship the art. Rather, you're supposed to worship the entities to whom the art refers. Excuse me, or we should say maybe reverence, or be aware of, or something. So it's a little bit unclear exactly what that is, but it's kind of one thing to say that. You can say, well, don't worship the image, worship, or don't reverence, maybe is a better word, or don't think on the image, but rather who the image refers to. Of course, how do you do that? How do you accomplish that? Again, think of this question. You and I, we are people living in this moment historically. How do we know what to do? Well, that's explained too. Next paragraph, the bishops shall carefully teach this. Love the word carefully. Carefully teach this, that by means of the histories of the mysteries of our redemption, portrayed by paintings or other representations, the people is instructed and confirmed in the habit of remembering and continually revolving in mind the articles of faith. So, interesting kind of a setup here. The artist paints an image, we'll say, for example, or sculpts something, but I want to focus mainly on painting. And the idea is that then there are people, bishops mentioned here, instructors, essentially, who, in other words, it might be not just bishops, but anyway, people who are there in a position to say, okay, here's the purpose of this art. It's not to be reverenced or worshipped in itself. These are not idols. Rather, this art is a kind of form of instruction, and it is to keep in mind certain stories, certain individuals that are presented in Holy Scripture, or who are sainted or whatever. Interestingly, this idea of revolving in mind the articles of faith as also that great profit is derived from all sacred images, not only because the people are thereby admonished of the benefits and gifts bestowed upon them by Christ, but also because the miracles which God has performed by means of the saints and their salutary examples are set before the eyes of the faithful, that so they may give God thanks for these things, may order their own lives and manners in imitation of the saints, and may be excited to adore and love God and to cultivate piety. In short, this art is to present certain kinds of images. It is a type of instruction, it is a type of leading, it is a type of reminding. This should be the function of art. Now, there's just a little bit more here that I want to focus on. There's a little bit more kind of interesting stuff. It says, moreover, in the invocation of saints, the veneration of relics, and the sacred use of images, every superstition shall be removed, all filthy lucre be abolished. And finally, all lasciviousness be avoided, in such wise that figures should not be painted or adorned with a beauty exciting to lust, nor the celebration of the saints, and the visitation of relics by any perverted into revelings and drunkenness, as if festivals are celebrated to honor the saints of the saints by luxury and wantonness. So, in other words, I don't know why I'm picking on Michelangelo tonight, but all those famous nude paintings, you know, if we think of the nude sculptures and so forth, all of that, that's not quite going to cut it with this council. This needs to be changed on some level. You can see how this is being set up. Finally, the one final thing I want to point out is, in fine, let so great care and diligence be used herein by bishops, as that there be nothing seen that is disorderly, or that is unbecomingly or confusedly arranged, nothing that is profane, nothing indecorous, seeing that holiness becometh the house of God. Well, there you go. Art is to be instructive. Art is to keep revolving in one's mind certain principles, certain examples of Christian ideals, Christian living, and so forth. It does not need to excite lust. This is what we have. Now, the question is, does the art that we see produced in this time and that we at least celebrate, does it do any of this? Well, we'll see. Did they just wad it up and toss it out? What do you think about this term Baroque? Now, don't worry, we're getting to some art here in just a minute, but I just want to think about this term for a minute. I don't know how often you've thought about the term. My guess is probably every day. But, you know, the Baroque is kind of a fascinating concept. It doesn't really get applied, this label, until after the period is over with. So it's a retroactively applied term. Now, there are some interesting background in the term. One of these is Baroque in Aristotelian logic. So Aristotle, in his system of logic, typically worked with syllogisms. A syllogism is essentially three statements. Often we'll call it deductive reasoning now. There's a major premise, a minor premise, and then a conclusion. And in fact, it took on many different forms in his system, and they all had different names. Now, one of these was called Baroque. And here's an example of it. All cats are mammals. Some pets are not mammals. Some pets are not cats. So you'll notice there's a positive statement, all cats are, but then you have two negatives. Now, this could take on a different form. You could have two positives and a negative, or a negative and two positives, and each one of these has a name, but this one is called Baroque. Now, by the time you get to the 1500s, there are whatever scholars maybe are familiar with this kind of a system, but it seems that also this term had taken on this implication of excessive complexity. Now, I find that odd because a syllogism, it seems to me, is elegantly simple. It may be dealing with very profound ideas, but it tends to be kind of simple in its form. And yet, somehow this term means excessive. Now, the great essayist Montaigne later would talk of Baroque as being bizarre and uselessly complicated. He's not talking about Baroque of Aristotelian logic. He's talking about the term Baroque. Now, let's bring this term Baroque in a little bit closer to how it would have maybe been used or thought of in the period we're talking about. Essentially, Baroque comes from this Portuguese word Baroque, but the French word is Baroque and Baroque. And the idea is that this is the word for a flawed pearl. So obviously, a very perfectly shaped pearl is ideal, and presumably more precious. A misshapen pearl is not so. But this kind of phrase gets at some interesting dimensions of the Baroque. Maybe not always easy to see the Aristotelian connection, but this connection is more so. This idea of being out of proportion, but an out of proportion that is not in the mannerist way of Michelangelo, but rather in a way that's actually very natural, because this pearl is so. It's a flawed look. It's out of whack, you might say. I mentioned here that Charles V has these in his inventory, and so this term is there. But again, people in the moment aren't really using this term. It's used retroactively, and usually not in a very positive way. So, Le Dictionnaire de l'Académie Française, 1762, refers to the Baroque as being irregular, bizarre, or unequal. Again, we could spend an entire hour just on Baroque music, and much more than that, in fact. But anyway, Baroque music is that in which the harmony is confused and loaded with modulations and dissonances. The singing is harsh and unnatural, and so forth. This is no less than Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing that. And then in terms of architecture, it's a style that is highly adorned, and my favorite word of all, tormented. Now, by the way, you do see his comment that the term seems to come from essentially Aristotelian logic. But how that gets applied is mysterious. Now, let me just say this. You might be wondering, okay, why am I bringing some of these things up and not connecting them? It seems to me that part of the quintessence of the Baroque is that certain things just aren't connected. They just happen. And that seems to me to be part of the illogic of it. There are certain movements historically that are more romantic and are looking to be more natural. Later on in the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s, we can think of Romanticism, whether in Germany or in Great Britain. Certainly Goethe or the poets John Keats, William Wordsworth, who we would say they are capital R romantics, and that their version of nature is a far cry from a more Darwinian one. But they were after emotion and passion and something that they saw as being more natural than, say, a mill. Well, these are some of these terms, and you can see in some of the early Baroque architecture, and this is one Chiesa di Gesù, this is in Rome, and this is they say the first Baroque facade. And you might say, well, what is it that's Baroque about it? Because it doesn't seem tormented in the way that we might think of the Baroque, which is usually tormented and basically means highly adorned in the sense of every available space is filled with something. In this case, not so much, but what's interesting is I'm going to use the cursor here. Maybe you can see it. This is the part that kind of starts to give it away a little bit. That kind of bend there. It's not that you wouldn't see it before, but these sorts of movements are more pronounced. It's really inside that you see the Baroque more, though. These very, again, kind of swirling, out of bounds kind of paintings. This is what's interesting. I want you to think about this. The Council of Trent, this movement in Catholic art. By the way, this wasn't just Catholic. In fact, there's a whole Lutheran version and even an Anglican version of the Baroque, but we often think of this as Catholic. Well, what's interesting is there's an implication of simplicity. There's a kind of teaching involved. There is a need to maybe to access and influence people. This is Rome. This is Catholicism fighting against Protestantism in its various forms, trying to keep or make converts. And so there's an idea of there's got to be a certain kind of simplicity implied in that you want to try and reach people, maybe people who can't read. Of course, this coincides also with a large movement toward vernacular, so not just Latin, but translation. Martin Luther translating the Bible into the German language, for example, and ultimately in English, the authorized version. So this is all a movement in some ways towards simplicity, and yet it's excessively complex. Now that's an interesting paradox. Why is it that complexity is there? Does that confuse you? Does that confuse me? Is that part of the point? Is it partly to be kind of overpowered? And here's this image here again of being kind of out of bounds, the sense of movement. And a lot of the architecture has this sense of movement in it, this idea of these twisted columns, the so-called Solomonic columns. The cartouche goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, hieroglyphics. A lot of times the names of the pharaohs and important figures and deity would be in cartouches. But of course, the cartouche would be put also to use in quadratura, this idea of the, uh, you know, we think about these ceiling paintings that use this trompe-l'oeil or the trick of the eye, de sotto in su. In other words, you're down below looking up above. And the sort of foreshortening, this is not just a Baroque thing by any means, but they take it in very interesting directions. For me personally, the most interesting is Andrea Pozzo here at the Chiesa di Sant'Ignazio de Loyola in Campomarzio. And this one, I don't know if you can tell, I'm going to use the cursor. If you can see these windows at the top and the bottom of the screen here of the picture, these are real windows, but everything from about where I'm pointing to in the middle here, all of that's just painted. It's a tremendous trompe-l'oeil, the trick of the eye. And but you can see this idea, and the idea this is a Saint Ignazio, Saint Ignazio ascending to heaven like an apotheosis into heaven. This is he here, and there's this movement upward, and it really is very, very powerful. Now, a lot of this activity, unsurprisingly, is happening in Rome, and Bernini, very famously, of course, so heavily involved in this designing of St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican, and you can see here certain elements that are so Baroque in terms of architecture. This big piazza that has this colonnade that sort of surrounds, it can surround thousands of people, and of course the basilica. Notice the dome, again, not unique by any means to this period, but they take it into bizarre and fantastic and very elaborate forms. And bizarre and fantastic and elaborate are key to the Baroque. But again, you and I, what does it mean? Are we overwhelmed? Do we say, wow, this is so complex and weighty and powerful that this must be the truth, as opposed to the far more simplistic kinds of things you see in the Protestant kind of presentation? Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Compostela. This is an example of the kind of Spanish take on this. And, here you can see that maybe the more tormented look, that just every little inch is decorated. And of course, this time period coincides with a lot of the building of the Spanish in South America. And so you see, not in Portuguese, but certainly the Spanish in South America, and you can see that Baroque influence there. And even in England, St. Paul's in England, designed by Christopher Wren. And you can, even though this is Anglican, it has all that feel to it. Well, my point, or where I want to go with this, within this, is to think about, again, this Protestant movement, maybe not so much Martin Luther, but certainly those iconoclasts and so many of those movements there, going toward a kind of simplicity, going toward a kind of an idea of a sort of a personal relationship and confession. I'm painting a very broad brushstrokes here, but within Christianity, as opposed to this far more public kind of a thing. What's the impact? Well, these buildings, as they developed, were very, very overwhelming and powerful. But I want to go inside a little bit more. I want to deal with this figure, Caravaggio's first name actually is Michelangelo. And I'm not going to spend too much time on these biographies of the artists I want to look at, but I do want to mention a few things about them, especially Caravaggio. Mainly, I just think it's very interesting that this lecture happens to be happening on September the 29th, 2021, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic Delta variety. Caravaggio was born September the 29th, 1571, 1576. He is out of the town of Caravaggio near Milan, or he goes to there, with his, I guess, family to escape the plague. So there you go. See, this was all meant to be. Anyway, I studied with an artist named Petrosano, but the interesting thing about this guy, and his biography is very intriguing. He was a man who is given to violence, and he was apparently something of a swordsman, and he got in trouble. He was constantly getting in fights and throwing artichokes at people and all kinds of things like that. Anyway, he actually fled to Rome after one of these altercations. There he was working with a man named Cesare, who was kind of very close to the Pope. And while he was there, he was mostly painting flowers and that kind of. I'm going to talk a little bit about some. I have only time to deal with just a few artists, but something I think sometimes that gets lost in the show, probably not the Flint Institute of the Arts. Sometimes I think that some of the actual working of the. I'm going to go back to that. I want to make sure you're still with me. Some of the inner workings or the techniques of painting are very important, and I just want to throw a little glance at those and think about the palettes of these people. In the time that these artists were, they could not go to, Jerry's or Naples or Utrecht, wherever, and to paint. A lot of the pigments were actually ground, and they were bought at the apothecary, so were used medicines and so forth. And just some of these are kind of interesting. The Verdigris, for example, Verdigris was basically the color, I guess it's copper that turns that kind of green color. And but one of the things Baroque is you see a lot of oil painting. So if you think about the Renaissance with fresco, where you have the powdered pigments that are mixed with, distilled water probably, and then the egg yolk and painted directly into the plaster. An exception, of course, Da Vinci, who was experimenting with oil to mix in as the kind of ground with these pigments. But oil really comes into its own in certain ways in the Baroque, I would argue. But anyway, Verdigris was, it would kind of start out as the kind of color you see on the Statue of Liberty or something, but then it would kind of change into more of a leaf color. But then sometimes it would turn all the way brown. And a lot of the early experimenting, the chemistry of everything, they weren't very familiar with it. Down here, you'll see madder, which is made of, it's kind of red, that's made of kind of putting in a mortar and pestle the root of the madder plant, and making a red out of it. But of course, the big colors here for Caravaggio really are red ochre and black and white. A lot of artists now, and by the way, I should say there's an entire movement of artists who are have been for decades now, looking to the styles of artists from this time period, from the Baroque. Richard Schmid passed away kind of recently, as one of the leaders in this. Also, I have a cousin who's an artist, Bob Tompkins, out of Jackson, Mississippi, and he works in this style. And a lot of these artists, their technique is the thing. I don't care if you're talking about Jackson Pollock or Caravaggio or name the artist. They may have tremendous differences in their philosophies, but technique is so key. And a lot of the techniques that you see here, where you have the dark colors that are very thin and then the lighter colors are laid on thicker, this kind of thing is possible with oil paint. And it's something that was developed in this time period. But typically the way Caravaggio would work, he would lay down a ground probably more like red ochre or umber, maybe a mix of those, scratch out the image with the end of a brush, or I don't know if they had a palette knife or something, and then he would lay in black. A lot of artists now, they don't like black much, but in fact, it has a history. And this was a way that Caravaggio could work very quickly. So you start with the middle ground of the red ochre or umber, get the black in there. That was most of that background, and then looming out of it would be the image. He would put the white in, and that way he could establish his values, middle value and his dark and his light. And then he would work from there very quickly, alla prima, as they say, wet on wet. So not working in different layers. Think about egg tempera, little small brush strokes, and you build it up, build the paint up on a ground of white. So a very sometimes elaborately developed ground of white, and the idea is the light kind of bounces back through those layers in a kind of satiny style. Well, I mentioned all those technicalities. We could talk about more of those, but to give you a sense of what he was doing, Caravaggio, and he's so important because he was making use of chiaroscuro. It's a nice Italian word, chiaroscuro. Next time you're talking to your loved one, you might mention chiaroscuro. What it means is a very strong contrast of light and dark. Caravaggio took it a little farther in what he called tenebrism or tenebrism. It's this idea of a certain drama. And what he would do is put the light source very close. I'm going to put my hand in the camera here with you now. Very light source is close, and then there would be this foreshortening of the image, so it looks like it's coming out at you. And all of it is very theatrical, and theatricality is key in those big architectural accomplishments of the Baroque and the paintings. Here you can see the martyrdom of Matthew. This is in one of the Roman churches, and you can see this use of light and shadow and this theatricality. You can see it a little bit more here. This is the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus. It's a controversial image at the time because the main thing you see is not only the horse, but the horse's rump. So this is Caravaggio. Now notice, if you think back to some of those Renaissance paintings where you get the full body of people and everything is carefully placed, and with Caravaggio, he'll have some, parts of the person will be outside of the canvas. You're close in. One of the things I want to point with the cursor is this putting the light on the forehead. This happens a lot with with these men in his paintings. You almost can forget that Paul's lying on the ground in the light and he's going to be converted. Rather, you have the horse here, and it bothered people. The horse's rump. Now, I want you to think about this. Here is this Council of Trent saying this art should be convincing, it should revolve in people's minds, heavenly ideas, Christian ideals, and so forth and so on. Well, how does this work? In fact, they found Caravaggio's way of doing things to be, even though he was a virtuoso painter, they were bothered by the style. Why would you have saints with dirty feet, for example? Or why would you have the horse's rump in your face and almost forget that Paul is even there? Well, Caravaggio was able to make this career anyway. But let me tell you something. There's something even off the canvas that is noteworthy because, in fact, his models were far from heavenly. They were prostitutes and pimps and tavern owners, and it made people very nervous. This is a Judas kissing Jesus to betray him, and you can see this intense moment. And again, right up in there, real close. And notice the armor, that chiaroscuro, that sharp contrast of light and dark. And notice the way it hits you. There's a complexity in it, and yet a tremendous simplicity to it. The point gets across. You feel the emotion in ways that a lot of artists have never been able to do quite as well as Caravaggio. Here's another one of my favorites, The Supper at Emmaus. You don't quite get it as easily looking at it here, but the man on the right-hand side, his hand is coming right at you. This little plate looked like it's about to fall. This little basket like it's about to fall off the table. And you can see the use of shadows. And this image apparently is too violent for Facebook, is what I've been told. But anyway, and sorry, I did the date wrong. 11,598. We've not gotten there quite yet. But anyway, this is what's interesting about this. This is a story of Judith beheading Holofernes. You can see the blood, you can see the knife. And by the way, Judith is the model was Elena Melandrone, who was actually a courtesan, which is sort of a romantic word for a prostitute. She showed up in a lot of his paintings. By the way, there's a painting in the Flint Institute of the Arts. If you're there tonight, and you can, I don't know if this one is out and visible, but there's a painting by Gregorio Lazzarini. And it's also of this, there's a Venetian painter. And this is also of Judith and Holofernes. Well, I have to give you this picture because I don't know if I mentioned this in the past, but I am a fencer with the Martinez Academy of Arms out of Manhattan. And there's a very interesting history that actually is also interlaced in fascinating ways with Western religion on the art of defense. And this is an image from Capoferro. And these are two Italian rapiers. They're using rapier and dagger style. So I have to show this to you. Mainly, my main reason for showing it to you now is that this Caravaggio was known to waltz about with his rapier. And he actually got into a fight, had a proper duel with a man named Ranuccio Tomassoni. And he actually killed him on May the 29th, 1606. Now, Tomassoni was actually the pimp of the woman who was the model for the painting we just saw, this one here. The Melandroni was her name, her last name, Judith and Holofernes. Well, when this happened, Caravaggio had to run away. He went to Naples and he painted this famous painting. We don't have time to go into it, but one you should check out sometime on your own time, The Seven Works of Mercy. And there he had just enough time to influence some people who would then develop the so-called cabal of Naples. Anyway, he was disfigured in Naples in a fight later. And this painting on the left-hand side is of John the Baptist's head on a platter. That head is actually the head of the artist, of Caravaggio. It's a self-portrait of his being beheaded. On the right-hand side, also, he's beheaded. In this case, he is standing in as Goliath, and this is David who has killed him. Well, he was quite a man. He died in Porto Ercole on his way, apparently, back to Rome. Nobody knows quite how he died. Now, why I mention all that is just because, hello, Caravaggio, you have to mention something about his life. What's interesting is he set up a precedent. He revolutionized the art, again, by really homing in on the subject, getting very close in. Again, that psychological intensity, the contrast, and all of those things. I want to go, we just have a little bit of time left. And by the way, I'm so appreciate everybody's attention here. But we got just a few more and then we'll be finished up here. And I'm sorry we can't have time to do questions, or it's not possible to do in this format. But I want to just deal with a few other of these artists in order to round out some of these major figures of this Baroque period. And again, to consider how they were. With Caravaggio, you have someone who is really directly engaging with these new ideas of art. How can art be used in this religious context? How can it be there to promote the principles of the Council of Trent, the larger principles of Catholicism that itself is navigating the changes coming with Protestantism, that is reforming in certain ways? How do you deal with that? Well, what does it mean when one of your champions is such a stinker as Caravaggio? He comes in there, one wonders how he had time to paint. He painted very quickly, by the way, but one wonders how he had time to when he wasn't busy killing people and just being a general stinker. As I say, he spent a lot of time in jail. How did he do it? Well, again, also, though, the larger question is, what does it mean that he is the person who revolutionizes painting? Now, certain people step in, influenced by him. Peter Paul Rubens is a Flemish painter, but he made a trip to Italy in the early 1600s. And there he starts to see paintings, and he is influenced by this work of Caravaggio. In fact, this is one of his portraits that has an element, this one here, this Velazquez. But on the left-hand side is a self-portrait of Rubens. And you'll notice all that dark, that black. But Rubens, he takes things in a little bit different direction. He does give you a little bit of blue sky. So just want to give you Rubens' palette. As you can see, my main point here is to say it's far more elaborate. Orpiment is my favorite one. I think maybe just because it was derived from arsenic. So I don't know, maybe I'm thinking about arsenic and old lace or something. But anyway, you can see a fairly broad palette. And Rubens, I should say, he did a workshop style of painting. So he produced a lot of paintings. He was, by the way, very cosmopolitan, multilingual. He made a lot of connections of various kinds. But he was also very talented at painting flesh, and especially the particular kind of full-bodied women that he loved to paint. But anyway, we can see on the right-hand side, again, this influence of Caravaggio and this very, again, kind of simplistic kind of a thing. But, and here's another one, Old Woman and Boy with Candles. But then he would follow this up with these far more complex kinds of paintings. One might say even excessively complex. This one is actually housed in the Ringling Museum in Florida. John Ringling not only was a circus guy, but had a Baroque museum there. And this one's really interesting. It's in a series having to do with the Eucharist. And but if you look, these angels at the top, this is actually a painted tapestry, and they're unfolding it or folding it. By the way, this gentleman here is looking right at you. But it's a very, very interesting kind of a painting. But notice again, you get some blue sky, you get some Caravaggio, but this movement. Now, this is one of the interesting things to me is that again, I just want to say it one more time. The Council of Trent seems to set certain principles there in place. And yet these artists start to take things in various directions. And by the way, Rubens particularly was fond of nude. He loved nude paintings and he loved to paint flesh. Very different from maybe what the Council of Trent had argued for. This, of course, is one of the really powerful paintings by Rubens that seems to be in tremendous motion, the Lion Hunt. And this, by the way, is one of his landscapes, just for the record. Anybody who's fascinated with Constable might find some interesting connections or similarities there, including this lady in red, which these kind of show up in interesting ways in some of the Constable paintings. All right, now, just a few more minutes here, if you can stay with me. I just have to give you Velazquez, and I suspect that there are some Velazquez fans here who, when they saw Caravaggio, thought, wow, he's sort of like Velazquez. It turns out that Caravaggio's, there's some interesting coursing and movement of people. So Rubens actually was able to move about Europe in certain ways and make certain connections and so forth. Interesting little thing about Vasquez, his parents, grandparents were conversos or converts from Jewish. They were Jewish converts. But anyway, just something about his palette. The most notable thing to me is smalt you see added on, but also Naples yellow. So lead white, just to comment on the technique, lead white can often kind of kill colors that it mixes with if you're trying to mix a lighter color. But Naples yellow can often preserve a lot of its gamma, I guess, or a lot of its integrity. Anyway, fairly more colorful in certain ways, maybe, than you see with Caravaggio. This is one of his early works, Avodagon. This is sort of like a everyday kind of still life of everyday people kind of a thing. A woman frying eggs is how it's said in English. But this, of course, is the interesting. We have the Adoration of the Magi on the right-hand side. It's very, very Caravaggio-like. But this one in the house, Christ in the house of Martha and Mary. The interesting is it's a Avodagon, or it's just, this image of just regular people, much like what you have at Caravaggio. And yet in here, in this window, there you see this religious element. And Vasquez had an interesting connection with that. Now, this one you see more of a pagan image. Again, some shades of both Caravaggio and Rubens may be at work in these. You see some of the lighter colors, but not so much a Catholic kind of thing. Of course, they could veer out from that. But here we have this portrait, Pope Innocent X. And in fact, what he was doing, Vasquez, with portraiture is very interesting. Now, the reason I want to close with portraiture with Vasquez and one more artist is to think about how, is for us to think about the different ways that people in this Baroque moment responded to their time. Again, so much of the Baroque impetus with a Caravaggio, a Bernini, again, the architect and sculptor and painter, is thinking about those massive buildings, the big cathedrals and the domes and all of this, and then paintings that were very, very public. But this question of how does the individual respond to that? That is the interesting thing to me. And my goal has been, and is in the few minutes I have remaining, is to try and get at that. What's going on psychologically? What can we see here? Portraiture takes us to the most intimate, including the self-portrait. Now, this painting it's called Ladies in Waiting in English, or Maids of Honor, you might say. And basically, Velazquez is painting the royal family in Spain, but he is standing right here. I'm circling him with my cursor. It's a self-portrait, and he's right there with the royal family. And we understand he's not royal himself, maybe, but notice the cross on his chest there, and notice the this kind of blending of the intimate and the public, you might say. It's in this matter of portraiture then that we come, of course, to this man, Rembrandt. Now, Rembrandt he was actually, he was not, he had how can I say, he was Protestant, but he had this Catholic connections as well. But he painted, by the way, here's his palette. Also, you'll notice far fewer pigment on his palette. This is actually a palette based on Apelles. There's a current Norwegian artist, Odd Nerdrum, who the Apelles, the Greek painter, has been of interest to artists for a very long time. The current artist, Odd Nerdrum, he basically uses this palette. It's white, yellow, red, and black. Although, in fact, they end up using a lot of brown, but Apelles eventually used only those four colors, white, yellow, red, and black. Zorn famously used this. He used a yellow ochre instead of a bright yellow, but used only those four colors primarily and you can mix a tremendous range of colors from these. But Rembrandt tended to have a very limited palette, and he tended to take the Caravaggio's Tenebrism or drama and psychological insight also into play, but it was a different style. It was more of a brown kind of a color. Here's an example of an Old Testament or Hebrew Bible painting, the binding of Samson. You'll see all that dark. You'll see the light, the shadows. It's a very different style in certain ways, but you can see the armor similar to the scene that we saw from Caravaggio earlier. This is one of my favorite paintings of all. This is Belshazzar and the hand that comes out of nowhere and writes these words on the wall. And this painting is in, I believe it's in the National Gallery in London, and it's very big, and the texture of it is very almost brittle. It's the light colors are kind of caked up, and this picture doesn't do it justice. What's interesting, so these are cases of biblical images, and Rembrandt was, but Rembrandt was he moved in a more personal direction, and the really interesting thing of his career are these portraits, the self-portraits. Here are some of these. Throughout his life, he painted these self-portraits. I want to end here because this, to me, brings us into this question. I don't know that I have answers for it. This might bother you. It just occurred to me. This might bother you that I have more questions than answers. My hope is that my goal has been to get us thinking about, again, who lives in this moment? What does the world look like to you? Now, interestingly, with these self-portraits, there's all this theatricality, different kinds of hats, different kinds of lighting, obscuring his face here, and this young one and this old one is a different kind of a look. Here is someone presenting himself, looking out at himself, but at you. He's looking at himself, but he's also looking at you at the same time. Who is Baroque? It is an image, a self-image that is filled with chiaroscuro and tenebrism. These are images with a kind of gaze that in moments seems very sure of itself, and maybe at certain moments not so. These are the images presented by oneself in a certain time, in this Baroque time. And I wonder about that. How does the larger issues of teaching about religion, but not worshiping or reverencing the image itself as an idol, how do these principles of Christianity as presented by Catholicism, how do they channel down into the everyday experience? The final image of Rembrandt's I want to show you is this one. Not long before he died, he painted these images here, this portrait, and it has two circles, the so-called self-portrait with circles. And nobody quite knows what the circles mean. Apelles and some other artists allegedly could make a circle without using a compass. A compass, so they could draw it freehand perfectly. And maybe this is what he is taking on here. But what is that? Is that exactly the same as Da Vinci's ways of thinking through the mathematics, guided by Luca Pacioli and others? Is that the same kind of thing, or is it a very different kind of a thing? In other words, Baroque subject. Who is it? Final image of all I want to show you is one that's in the Flint Institute of the Arts. It's a painting, a portrait. It's called Cleopatra. It's painted by Elisabetta Serragni, who was part of the Bologna school. Now, Bologna had a pretty important history in terms of painting at this time, and we don't have time. There are many artists, the Carracci we can deal with, the Cabal of Naples. We're not even touching Vermeer. But I wanted to end with this one, partly because, again, this is an image in the Flint Institute of the Arts, but it's also a portrait of, guess what, the only woman artist we're talking about here. Now, you can see the influence of Caravaggio, painted somewhat decades after Caravaggio is around. You can see the contrasts. We can see the particular colors. You can see that she's holding a pearl in her hand, but it's not a misshapen pearl. The Baroque. What are its paradoxes, and how does the person who lives in that time deal with those? Obviously, that answer is not a simple one, and it is highly individualistic. And in a way, that maybe gets at kind of what our understanding of the Baroque in the end is. Again, one of the interesting things to me about the Baroque is it's very rarely spoken of. I should say this, not so much often as you might think is it spoken of across the arts. You'll have people who focus very much on Baroque music, whether it's Biba or Bach or, I don't know, Vivaldi. You'll have people talking about scholars and others who will talk of painting or architecture, not so much literature. Literature is working in a very different idiom, in some ways, a far more personal idiom, an idiom that doesn't work necessarily quite so easily with these large public goals and forces. But the self-portrait is an interesting blend. There's the blend of the motion and movement and even music of composition. There's the engagement with the larger issues of religion and how art should function. And yet there's that expression of the self. And I think that, for me, is what brings the Baroque closest. Caravaggio's paintings, sometimes they almost look like photographs. And I say that trying to convey, again, the intimacy of them. Their motion, their movements, they seem close to me. I, as an American, feel very close to those people. And what is that? And what is it about the portrait? In fact, as you may have seen, the portrait has run right through this entire discussion. From the self-portraits of the beheaded Caravaggio, self-portrait that we had, Peter Paul Rubens, all the way up to Rembrandt and Velazquez. What is that experience of the individual? It's a question I want to leave you with. I hope it's one that you will consider. My biggest hope is that you have enjoyed seeing these images and hopefully thinking about some of these large forces and how they maybe affect a person. My hope is that maybe you will go away and consider these things and think on them. And when you look at Baroque art moving forward, that you'll think about that interaction, the ways that the individual deals with those larger, massive forces. Well, I want to thank you so much. Thank you very much for the applause. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And I do have my email address here. Please feel free to jot it down. And I would love to hear from you. And I'm so sorry again that we can't speak in person here. But please feel free to contact me, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. And finally, I want to say thank you once again to everyone, to Dr. Klein, to Tracy, to Lori, to Catherine, everybody else there in Flint. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hagood, for that fascinating talk. And please remember to email any questions you have for him. I'd like to conclude by thanking everyone for attending this talk with Dr. Taylor Hagood, and have a great evening, everyone. Good night.